welcome everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Sarah Edwards. I'm the Executive Director of the Just Money Movement, and we're delighted to welcome Ann Pettifor this evening, who is going to be our speaker for this Money Talks event. This is like an occasional series that we have at Just Money where we give opportunities for people to hear from experts in their field, whether that's in finance or economics or theology or activism. And the format is that I'll just say a little bit about Just Money, then I'll introduce Anne to you, the main event, the reason that you're here, and we'll hear from her for around about 30 minutes. But Anne is very keen to get to the Q&A because that's what she likes to do, to have some discussion. And we've had already submitted lots of really good questions, and I'm sure we will have plenty more. So there'll be a good chunk of time for Q&A afterwards. And then we'll mention at the end just a few practical ways. So we don't just have the sort of the abstract, but also the practical things, the ways that you can take action, get involved in working for a more just and sustainable financial system. And we will wrap up by 8:30. So I hope that's everyone's expectation. A few words of housekeeping. As I mentioned right at the beginning, we are recording the event. So if you don't want to be filmed, please do keep your camera off. Participants, you're on mute for the duration because it's a fairly large group. So we'll handle the Q&A through the chat function. So please do share your questions in the chat. I think that's all the housekeeping. So just to say a couple of things about Just Money as we get going, in case you're not familiar with us, we have been around for over 30 years actually. Before 2022, we were known as ECCR, the Ecumenical Council for Corporate Responsibility. We are a Christian organisation. We work across the UK churches, supporting both individuals and congregations across the UK in order to connect our faith with finance and the wider economy, and to help people to reflect and understand those issues, but also to take action, both in terms of our own choices with our money and also in terms of campaigning for change in the way that money is used by banks and businesses and through the tax system. We have lots of educational resources and training, as well as campaign actions, both for individuals and churches that are seeking the transformation of our financial system and the wider economy so that it serves people and planet. And I'll say a bit more about some specific things around that at the end. And that's very much rooted in our faith commitment to loving our neighbour, caring for creation, and our values of dignity and justice and compassion. So this evening's talk is just really pertinent, really exciting, really relevant to what we work on. And I want to introduce Ann Pettifor to you all now. Probably needs very little introduction, but I'll just say a couple of things. Ann's an international political economist, best known for predicting the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 with her book, The Coming First World Debt Crisis. She's the author of a whole range of books, including The Case for the Green New Deal and The Production of Money. And her latest book, which she's going to talk to us about this evening, is called The Global Casino: How Wall Street Gambles with People and Planet, which focuses our attention on the global financial system, especially the activities of speculators and their impact on our ecosystem and our cost of living. But it'd be much better to hear all of this from Anne. So without further ado, I will hand over to you. Anne.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you to everyone at Just Money for organising this. Above all, thank you to those participants who turned up for the previous event that I failed to switch on. Somehow I was at my desk, but I missed altogether. I blame my age. Anyway, it's just delightful to be here. And also really good to hear that what Just Money is doing is integrating the story of the economy into faith, into our faith. For me, it is so fundamental. And when we were running the Jubilee 2000 campaign, I remember we came across this argument so often. And I had particular difficulties with the Lord's Prayer. I had been brought up, I was pretty sure, to say, forgive us our debts as we forgive the debts of others. And then I came across this word trespassers, and I felt it sort of was kind to skip a fundamental point in the Lord's Prayer. But also that quite often what happened when we understood that actually the Bible was largely about economics and about economic justice, when many of those ideas were, if you like, spiritualized and made less meaningful. And for me, actually, my faith is, is embedded in this notion that the Bible is about economics and it's about power. It's about the power of the little people versus the power of the powerful. And that's where I want to begin today, because the story today in all our newspapers is this man, Elon Musk, which Paul Krugman, the economist, called a standing Ponzi scheme. So Elon Musk is now a trillionaire. This is a new word we've had to learn. He is probably one of the most powerful men in the world. He not only has now got access to enormous quantities of money, he has also had access to political power and used that political power to strip the American state of its ability, for example, to aid the poorest people in the world. And as we watch the Ebola vaccine and the Ebola disease expanding and killing more and more people, we must bear in mind that the shortage of medicines that the people in the Congo are suffering at the moment is largely to do with those cuts that Elon Musk made to the American USAID budget a year or two ago. So I want to begin with him because what I want to talk about is the way he makes his money. And one of the key things I want to talk about is how he makes his money by not paying any taxes at all. So under US law, if you own financial assets, you do not pay taxes on those assets until you sell them. If you just hang on to them, if you're stocks and shares, or you own bonds in US Treasury bills or any other kind of financial asset, if you just hold on to them, you can use them as collateral. You can use them to leverage, as it's called, additional finance. And what he did when he bought Twitter was to argue that he had shares in Tesla, and those were shares on which he paid no taxes. And he kind of argued, as others have shown, that actually that wasn't cash, that wasn't anything he had, and that's why he couldn't pay taxes on it. He would not be expected to pay taxes on it until he'd realized those shares. And so, in other words, until he'd sold those shares and collected the cash. So as long as he had his wealth in shares and stocks and shares, he didn't have to be taxed. He wasn't taxed. Nevertheless, he used those shares as collateral to argue that he could buy Twitter. But when it came to actually buying Twitter, he didn't have the money. What he then did was to go to the banks and say, I have these shares. So in other words, he uses the collateral more than once. If you took out a mortgage and you said to the bank, I've got a property, an existing property against which I want to borrow another, £1 million. If you used that property and then went to another bank and said to them, I've got a property as collateral and I would like you to give me £500,000, you'd be using the same collateral twice, and that's illegal. That's not allowed. He did that, though. He said to his borrower, to the banks, I've got these stocks and shares in Tesla, and I offer them to you to collateral, so can you lend me money? Can you lend me enough money to buy Twitter? And they said yes, because those Tesla shares are valuable, and he would want. They could grab them and sell them if he defaulted. And then, because the money that he'd borrowed to buy Twitter was debt, he didn't pay taxes on those either, right? So his whole way of acquiring wealth. And to be fair, that he built Tesla, which is a car company, and he was responsible for the engineering, and he is apparently a brilliant engineer, and that had value. But the way he added extra value, the way he added additional wealth, was by this shady way in which the rich get richer and the rest of us don't. And it's really striking because we now live in a world where those who have collateral, let's call it assets, property, valuable property, can access additional finance. Those who live, for example, in social housing, or who rent and don't own that collateral, they can't access additional finance easily. And that's partly why we have this massive rise in inequality. And it has now become, in my view, really quite obscene. I don't have any other word for it. It's an obscenity, what is going on now. And what he's done is, in this launch of his IPO, is that he's taken his Tesla company and mixed it up with his SpaceX company and then added in his Twitter company. And on the back of that, he said, this is all valued at this much, right? Now, the SpaceX company makes losses, substantial losses. Tesla makes profits. Oh, and then, of course, he's also got the satellite company. And the satellite company is quite profitable. There are 10,000 satellites circulating the Earth right now. And those are profitable. But on balance, the offer isn't, in my view, entirely, definitely profitable. What he's doing now is he's going to the market to get the little people to give him money, to buy shares in his company. The little people, retail investors. And retail investors are rushing to this thinking, I will get rich and richer as he has got rich and richer, because the value of those shares are bound to just keep rising forever. And, I'd be able to pay down the mortgage and so on. So they're rushing in to lend him money. What he's doing is he's shifting the burden of risk on his assets onto the little people. And that is, in my view, quite shocking, because people aren't conscious of that's what he's doing. The AI companies are doing the same. They've run out of cash. They've borrowed too much money. They're now in difficulties. They're going to launch IPOs as well. And the little people are going to run to invest in what is a very giant bubble right now. And when I say the little people, I don't mean to be patronizing. I mean they are people who aren't fully aware of the shenanigans, the financial shenanigans going on behind the scene. But then there's something even more evil about what he's done with this system, which is that he's launched on the NASDAQ exchange, and he's persuaded the regulators, thanks to his connections to Donald Trump, to make it possible for pension funds, not make it possible, to make it imperative for pension funds to buy his stocks and shares. Why? Well, normally, when you launch on the NASDAQ, you launch your company, you launch it as an IPO, and you invite shareholders to buy it. And when you throw it in, you say, I think it's valued at this. And what happens then is that the value either goes up or it goes down. Depends on what the market thinks of the value, right? And what the NASDAQ rule was that you have to have your company in that market for 3 months so that investors can judge its value. What he has done is to persuade NASDAQ to shrink that, I think it's to 15 days. Now, when it becomes one of those assets on the NASDAQ, which can be used by index-based funds, and those index funds are funds that use a whole range of indices as an asset. Pension funds are obliged to purchase index-based funds, right? In other words, he won't just be getting money from millions of investors, ordinary retail investors. He will also, by obligation, be getting money from those who hold pension funds. And that can be companies like BlackRock, or Blackstone, or, I mean, there's a range of asset management funds who manage pensions. So your pension might be one based in Britain, but it's quite possible that your pension fund has channeled some of your savings into BlackRock or one of those big asset management funds, because BlackRock, for example, manages $13 trillion in financial assets. And because it's got all of these financial assets at its disposal, it can pick and choose where it invests, and it can get the highest rates of return on its investments. So we're now in that position where not only are retail investors taking on the burden of risk that something might go badly wrong with that company, and they would make losses, and they would have to face those losses as individuals. Not only those people will face losses, but so will pension funds should anything go wrong. Now, the whole delusion of the stock market story is that the stock market never falls. It just keeps rising. And, we've settled the Iran war, apparently, or the United States president says he has. The oil price has suddenly dropped again. That's done through speculation. Suddenly the market today has gone whoosh, which has helped Elon Musk attract even more investors. So I wanted to tell you that story because it's so live. It's what's happening now. But it's a clear indication of why we have high levels of inequality and why we have such high levels of economic injustice. And it's down to the system that we've created, and I want to talk about that in a moment. So I've just written a book because I'm really concerned that when we think about the economy, it's much easier for us to think about the household, how we manage our own economy, about the economy of our city or our region or our district, about the national economy, right? And we can be so engrossed in all of those ways of looking at the economy that we can miss what's going on in the stratosphere, is what I like to call it. It's a sphere that's really beyond the national boundaries that we live within. And I'm conscious that very few of us know about that. And that's not a mistake on their part. That's deliberate. It's designed. It's designed, and the language used is designed to befuddle anyone, to deliberately obscure what's going on. And because they'd rather not be interfered with at all by anybody. And it's very convenient for them. But for me, I think it's absolutely essential that we, the citizens of this country, should understand what is going on. And why? Well, because everything that is really fundamental to our livelihoods and our happiness, our well-being, is obtained from markets that are global markets. Now, right now, we're perfectly, all of us, well aware, well conscious of the global market in energy. Ed Miliband would like to lower the cost of energy. He would like to somehow subsidize our energy bills and lower them for us because it's politically very unpopular for energy bills to rise. But he has no control over the price of energy. That is determined by global markets, and those global markets have been designed to ensure that politicians like Ed Miliband do not interfere in the market for that energy, right? So I'm very struck by the fact that in the United States at the moment is awash with oil and gas, thanks to fracking and thanks to discoveries they've made in the Gulf of Mexico. They have more gas and oil than they need themselves. There's no shortage of it. And yet Americans are paying a global price for petrol at the petrol station, for their what gas they call it. Now, of course, paying the global price, which has been around $100, is really good for the producers of that oil and that gas, but it's really bad for the consumers. But the Americans, who this powerful state, this powerful government, with all the oil and gas in they could wish for, have still got to pay a price that has nothing to do with the supply and demand for oil and gas in their country. It's fixed, and something, and there's a market that I would really like all of you to remember and to think about after this talk, and it's the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And that's where the price of oil is ultimately fixed. And I want to explain to you how that works, because in 2000, President Clinton, and I explain this in my book, together with Larry Summers and Alan Greenspan, decided to deregulate the market in commodities, and oil and gas, of course, are commodities. And that market, the dominant market, there's more than one. Wall Street plays a role in this as well, but really the dominant market, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Now, in that market, real traders come in and they have to buy oil. They may be an oil company having to buy oil from some Saudi prince or whatever, and they may be a Saudi prince that needs to sell oil, right? Those people are trading in what we call wet barrel oil, right? Wet barrel oil prices, wet barrel trades. And they're important because they are subject to supply and demand. But there's another trader in the market, and those are the paper barrel traders, right? They're not wet barrel traders, they are the paper barrel traders. In other words, they don't own an ounce or a gallon of oil. What they own is a bet, a gamble, a wager, if you like, on whether or not the price will go up by $1 or $3, or will it fall by $4 or $5. So when President Trump issues one of his foolish tweets in the morning, just before the markets open, he does it in such a way as to influence those speculators. They gamble whether it should go up, or it'll go up or down, depending a lot on what he says. And we can see what happens. And we can also see, we know that on one day, for example, someone in his office made a bet 15 minutes before he spoke on whether it was going to go up or down. I can't remember quite what, and made $650 million from that trade, right? So there are more of these paper traders than these wet barrel oil traders in that market. Because actually speculating, gambling, is a much easier thing to do than actually having to go and dig out the oil from the ground, ship it around the world and flog it to some company that needs to provide oil for cars or whatever. And so the world now is, and this is something that I think is really important for us all to understand, that people who have money nowadays don't want to spend it on investing in the old-fashioned way that capitalists used to do. You know, capitalists used to invest in the land, let's buy up that strip of land and build a railway line, and labour, let's employ workers to fix the railway, to build the railway line and to fix the engines and keep it going and to staff the trains. No, that's hard graft. That's hard graft capitalism. And that doesn't happen anymore. Much easier is to be a paper trader at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and to make what I call easy money, which is money you make effortlessly, right? Now, as far as I'm concerned, that is a sin. And I would love the churches to come out and accuse speculators of sinful behavior. But there we go. So that's going on, and that's just energy. But food prices are also fixed at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Prices of all the grains, wheat, rice, etc., soya beans, they're all bought and sold at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So there's energy, there's food, and then there's money, because the Wall Street is the place where there is a market in money. Now, I want to talk about that for a moment because there's a lot of confusion in the economics profession about what money is. And my book goes some way to try and explain that. But conservative economists, and I think economists like F.A. Hayek, believe that money is essentially a commodity. It's like gold or silver. It's most like gold or silver. It's most like a thing. And if you think of money as a commodity, as, for example, lumber or soya beans, you know there are limits to the amount of soya beans there are in the world, and there's a limit to the amount of lumber there is in the world. So the whole point of thinking about money as a commodity is that you then think about it as scarce. There's only this much money in the world, and that's all that we can spend. And that's the basis of all austerity programs. There is no money. Now, we know, and economists have known from way back in 1705, when John Law, who's a famous economist, notorious as well, but a famous economist, understood money as a social construct. Keynes understood that money as a social construct. There were many, Schumpeter understood money as a social construct. There are many, many economists that understand money as a social construct. But the dominant economics in the professions think of money as a commodity. And now, if you think of money as a social construct, what money is, and you know it is, because this is what you do every day, it's a promise to pay. If you look at your £10 note, it says, I promise to pay. So the £10 note is representative of your promise. It represents your promise. If you go into a coffee shop to buy a cappuccino and a croissant, which I do, and she charges you £5 something, you wave your card at a machine. And the card says, Ann Pettifor, you can trust Ann Pettifor to pay for her coffee, signed by the bank of NatWest or whatever the bank is, right? And here is the emblem which says, and you wave it at the machine and you take your card and you put it back in your pocket. There's no barter, there's no exchange. All you've done is to promise to pay. And sure enough, that promise goes into the system. The coffee shop registers as a deposit, but then it makes a collection from your bank. Not straight away, probably later, right? You'll see the bank transfer the money to the shopkeeper. If you go to Curry's to buy a washing machine, for example, and that's going to cost you £300-400, you take your credit card. Now, there is no money in your credit card. The bank forces you, obliges you to not put any money in your account. They don't want to manage your deposits. They make money from your promises. They don't make money from your deposits. So you're forbidden from putting money in your bank, your credit card account. So when you go to buy your washing machine, there is no money in your credit card. You're not swapping the money that's here with the shopkeeper over there, right? What you're doing is you're waving at the machine and you're saying, I promise to pay. And this promise is underpinned by, first of all, a commercial bank and then by the Bank of England. And you put the money back, you put the credit card back in your pocket. Now, that's a social contract. But what's happened over time is that we've mixed up the pound note, the checkbook, the check, or the debit card or the credit card, and as money. But can you see it's so blindingly obvious that the debit card isn't money? It's just simply a promise to pay. Anyway, if you understand that, you have a completely different conception of money. You understand then that what's really important about money is that it is part of a system. That who is going to uphold your promise to pay? Well, we know that in our country we have a criminal justice system which backs up your promise to pay. We have a Bank of England which backs up the value of the currency in which you make your promises to pay. We have an accounting system which is standardized, which shows what your balance, debit and surplus and so on. And so we have these public institutions that uphold our promise to pay. Without those public institutions, there would be no money. And I know this because I worked, for example, in Malawi. In Malawi, there is no confidence in the central bank. There isn't a criminal justice system that enforces contracts and that makes sure people uphold their promises. If there is a criminal justice system, it's very poorly financed, it's very inadequate. There aren't standard accounting systems which are checked and regulated. There aren't commercial banks that are trusted, right? And as a result, there is no money in Malawi. Malawi doesn't have the system and the infrastructure needed to uphold the promise to pay. And that's a tragedy. And that's a tragedy because the IMF and the World Bank visit Malawi and say, don't worry about building public institutions. That's not something you should put your money into. Hang on, we'll give you some US dollars. We'll hand over the US dollars and you can have those and you can buy what you need with those US dollars. Well, of course, that immediately makes Malawi subject to somebody else's institution, somebody else's financial system. And of course, that is unsustainable. And it's why so many poor countries that don't have a monetary system, a well-financed monetary system, that's why they suffer so much. Because the IMF is determined that they shouldn't build the public institutions they need, but instead that they should borrow, cross-border borrowing, which is really dangerous for them. And then we have a central bank, and the key thing about the central bank, and this is where, for me, where Christianity comes in, and which I think is really important. Key thing about the central bank is that it's able to generate new money. It's able to create money out of thin air, just as the bank is able to create. If you go to a bank and want to buy a house and you need, £500,000 for it, the bank doesn't have £500,000 in its vaults. It's not got Mrs. Jones's savings here and you're borrowing it. Mr. Smith is borrowing it and there's an exchange going on. No, there is no money in the bank. What the bank does is it issues a promise to pay to you. You have to sign a contract. You have to agree to a term of repayment. And finally, you have to agree to the rate of interest on that borrowing, right? And the system at the moment is that commercial banks have the power to set the rate of interest at a rate that they consider acceptable, right? There's competition, so they're quite careful about staying in line with other banks. But the Bank of England also has the power to issue new money. It issues new money to the commercial banks on the one hand and to the government on the other. So there's a huge power that the central bank has. I call it the foundational power of the state. I mean, when it issues that money, the Bank of England has the power to fix the interest rate. And that's not fixed by the market. That's fixed by a committee of men and women sitting around a table who determine whether or not the interest rate should go up or it should go down. And the higher the interest rate, the more difficult it is for debtors. The higher the interest rate, the more profitable it is for creditors. We live in a creditor-dominated society where creditor interests take priority over debtors. And for me, the real sin is the sin of usury. And it's a word that I am passionate about and that I want Christians to be trumpeting from the rooftops, really. Because we used to regard usury as a sin. In the old days in Florence, if you were a banker and you were charging interest on your loans and high rates of interest, you could be excommunicated overnight. Your daughter couldn't marry in a church. You could not be buried in sacred ground, right? In other words, you were excluded from this very important institution, which at the time was the Catholic Church. And so what the Florentine bankers used to do was to say, look, I will give you money for works of art. Pope, here is Michelangelo, and he's going to create something beautiful for you, and I'm going to give this to you to put in the church. And please forgive me for my usury. or pretend you haven't noticed. But we forgot about the sin of usury with the rise of Protestantism, I have to say. I don't want to go into that in much detail, but the fact of the matter is we don't talk about usury as a sin anymore. Islam insists that usury is a sin and talks about it as a sin. So, if I have a message to you, it's that you must go out and talk about this, because interest rates, the rate of interest is a mathematical and arithmetical system. It can rise exponentially. It can be compounded, right? And it can become incredibly expensive if anyone should default on debt at any point of time. But even if you don't default on your debt, if your income falls below the cost of your borrowing, you can get into very serious trouble. And if you're not fortunate like Elon Musk and can avoid taxes by borrowing, then you're in deep trouble. And for me, it's not just the sin of wealth extraction, effortless wealth extraction from those who have very little wealth. And that's what's sinful about it. It's also ecologically unsound, because if we have high real rates of interest, that means we have to do more exploitation of nature in order to repay our debts. So if you think of Brazil, Brazil does have to strip its forests to raise the money to pay down its debts, because its debt has risen exponentially. If you think about, the seas have to be fished. We've got to fish the seas, we've got to strip the forests, we've got to degrade the land in order to repay this exponentially rising rate of interest on debts. And we are in a situation at the moment, and one of the reasons I was able to predict the financial crisis, and Sarah, I seem to be going on for a very long time. Is it okay still to continue?
You're okay for a couple of minutes, absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I could predict the financial crisis was that I'd been working on sovereign debt with Jubilee 2000. And, the poor countries owed about $300 billion of debt, and we wanted to have that written off. We only had about $100-something billion written off, that's all. But nevertheless, it made a difference. And then I looked up at Anglo-American debt, and I realized that it massively exceeded Anglo-American income. And it was something like 100 and, I can't remember, I think it was something like 125% of GDP, of income. But in 2024, global debt, according to the IMF, was something like 235% of global income, global GDP. And you can look that up under the IMF on the 14th of September 2025. 235. Now, some of that is public debt, but the overwhelming majority of it is 143% of it is private debt, right? Now, I knew before the financial crisis, and I know now that is going to implode. That debt will never get repaid. And there are only three things you can do to deal with debt. And the first is to inflate it away. So we have to have inflation. Inflation is very good for debtors, is very bad for creditors. So they're going to try and do everything to avoid inflation. You could just default on it. Or you could generate the income needed to help pay down the debts. But we now live in a global economy in which people's incomes are falling in real terms, while the income or the wealth of the 1% is rising. And so the possibility of many of those private borrowers, those people who today might have borrowed money to gamble on the stock exchange and buy Elon Musk's shares, there comes a point when actually they may not be able to repay that. And when that happens, as it happened in 2007, all those people had taken out mortgages at 15%, thinking, I don't care that it's as high as that, as long as I've got a roof over my head. And you can understand how important that is to people. Nevertheless, at some point, they ran out of the money to pay. And boom, the whole thing blew up. Anyway, on that cheerful note, I think I'll stop now, and I hope people have got questions and so on.
Thank you so much, Anne. Wow. I think we're all on tenterhooks. That was, yeah, just incredibly insightful and fascinating. And I know people will have questions. Please do put your questions in the chat and I can pick them out as we go along. So I will kick off though with some of the questions that we've had submitted beforehand from people. I'll give you I've tried to group them. So there's a couple here which I think go well together. Because you've painted a picture of quite a bleak picture, as you say, quite a grim note on which to end. So perhaps to think about what could be done. Someone has asked, I want to know what's not what just what's wrong with the current system, but what a vision of a better way could be. What's your vision for how international finance could work? And then, secondly, what could be some effective levers to rein in speculation and make the financial system serve the real economy and people and planet?
Um, this is a very big question, and thank you for it. So there are several things. What could we do as individuals? It's quite hard to know what we can do as individuals. I my my experience of Jubilee 2000 was that understanding the system is the first step in, if you like, building the power for change. And I say this because when we embarked on the Jubilee 2000 campaign, lots of people said to me, you can't campaign on this stuff. It's far too complicated. Multilateral debt, bilateral debt, commercial debt, you know, uh, the rate of interest on that debt, there are all sorts of concepts in international financial relationships between creditors and debtors. You just cannot get that across to the public. And I said, that's not true. It means you've got to understand what's going on and you've got to communicate it. And when people get it, they'll be mad as hell. And sure enough, I mean, when the G8 summit came to Birmingham in 1998, before some of you might have been born, hundreds, thousands of people turned up, and Tony Blair was totally, befuddled by it because they didn't expect there'd be that many people interested in something as arcane as sovereign debt and as the sovereign debts of poor countries. Nothing to do with what was going on here, everything to do with what was going on there. So we know that knowledge can empower people. And I always tell this story because it's so important to me. I remember a Treasury official coming to me and saying, Anne, I don't know what the hell's going on here. I get letters on pieces of pink paper with a bunch of roses in the corner. And it says, Dear Sir, I understand that you have chosen for Uganda's cut-off date for calculating debt is 1983. And I think that's entirely unreasonable because you're excluding an enormous amount of debt. You creditors, are doing that. You're fixing that date in order not to deal with the debt that really is painful for Uganda. And he said, who the hell told her what Uganda's cut-off date was? And I said, we told her. It's not rocket science, it's not that complicated. And once she understood, she was empowered. She sat at her kitchen table and she wrote that letter, and the Chancellor was obliged to respond, right? So for me, the first step is knowledge and understanding, which is why I would like you to buy my book and read my book, or borrow it from the library. Then there's the question of what do we do globally? And for me, the answer is in what we did in 1945. If you look at the Bretton Woods Conference, everything we agreed to do there is what we need to do now. They too lived through an era of globalization. They called it the gold standard, but it was globalization as well. Laissez-faire, it was called, where there were no restraints on the movement of money across the world, across borders. They lived in a world where the markets decided on interest rates, not public authority. They lived in a world in which there was virtually no regulation, right? And that led to government by markets. And what happened was there was an uprising against globalization in the 1930s. And it was called fascism because what happened was people wanted to be protected from these global markets that were stripping them of food and energy and housing and so on. And they turned to strong men and women to defend them, right? And we saw fascism. And we're doing this exactly the same thing. We're going through exactly the same process again. So what they did at Bretton Woods was to say, we want to manage the flow of capital across borders. We want to manage interest rates in order to keep them low and sustainable. We want to manage the creation of money so that it's invested in productive activity and not in gambling and speculation, right? Those are the things they decided to do then. We could decide to do that now. Now, what's problematic about that is that they gathered at the Bretton Woods Hotel in New Hampshire and they agreed on doing it internationally. They were all going to do it because it's no good one country doing it and another doesn't. Although we live in a world in which one country at the moment does do that, and I'll come to that in a minute. Much better if we could all do it in a coordinated way. And that's what we need to do to fix the system, is to manage capital flows across borders. It's because money can't cross borders because the promises can't be upheld across borders. Secondly, we need to manage interest rates. We need to manage the creation of credit so that it's used purposefully and productively, etc. Now, China does that at the moment. China has what is called digital sovereignty. She has a degree of autonomy and sovereignty which Britain and Europe do not have, right? Because China has capital controls. China manages the flow of capital across her borders. She invests in her own economy and she builds her own tech, for example. She's dealing herself with the climate crisis. And now there's lots wrong with China. China's an authoritarian state and she's imposed these regulations top down. We don't want to be authoritarian, and I'm not recommending that at all. But I'm showing you that it can be done, and it is being done by one country. The question is, our politicians haven't a clue. If you had to talk to Keir Starmer now and tell him that he should be advocating that sort of thing, his eyes would glaze over. He wouldn't know what you were talking about. As far as he's concerned, what matters is what tax we're paying today and how much we're spending on welfare and whether we can cut welfare to pay for defence. The Bank of England doesn't enter into it. You know, the creation of credit by the Bank of England is not something we're allowed to talk about. And if the Bank of England puts up interest rates and makes the government's debt even more expensive and makes it even harder for the government to spend money on welfare or whatever, Mr. Starmer says, well, that's show business. It's just as it is, you know. And so we have a real problem. Our politicians have no idea what we're going through and why we're going through it and what we need to. So what we need is a bottom-up movement of people like you who've got to go and tell them.
Fantastic. Good. We will come to that. Can I ask you a couple of specific sectoral questions? There's one in the chat. You talked about energy and you talked about food. So a question on energy. Why can't we uncouple renewable energy from global fossil fuel market rates so we can let the market work at migrating from fossil fuels to renewables? And then the food one is one that someone submitted earlier. The ability for commercial interests to patent living organisms and oblige farmers to use pesticides and excessive fertilizers to grow our food is turning farmers into modern day serfs. How can this process be resisted or reversed?
Right. I mean, the second question I find more difficult to answer. I don't know enough about, I mean, there's clear corruption and corporatism there. And it's about, that's a difficult territory for me. On the first one, remind me again, Sarah, what was the first one?
It's about fossil fuels and renewables.
Yeah.
So how can we uncouple renewable energy?
That's a really, I mean, the point is it's really hard to do that. We would have to have the domestic market for fuel, right? Now, it's not as much of a problem for us as it is for Spain. Spain has loads of solar power. And, you know, when we were going through the energy crisis, Spain began to argue, why am I paying the gas price, which is the most expensive fossil fuel is gas. Why am I paying the gas price for something that costs nothing to produce, our solar power? And they began to argue, if they could disentangle themselves from the system. I don't think they've succeeded, but they are trying. And we should be trying too. But I don't think our politicians even know that that's the problem, really. It would mean that we would no longer have a global market for energy, right? And that would mean we would have to, for example, have our own buffer stocks of energy. We may, we would want to manage the supply and demand for energy to suit our domestic economy. And that's what we did before globalization, but we can't do that now. So that's the reason why, and the reason why markets have been able to go beyond boundaries and operate out there is because of capital mobility, because we don't restrict the movement of capital. And so to do that is going to mean, to sort of decentralize the whole process of energy. Now, if we are short of oil or gas, that becomes a problem. But we would, for example, if we were short of oil and gas and we had to look after ourselves, we would make massive efforts to get clean energy out, because we've got water, we've got massive wind, and we could even have more solar power, and we're building nuclear power, So we could make ourselves ultimately self-sufficient and thereby keep the price and disentangle. But at the moment, we don't choose to do that. We choose to stay in the global market. And the same applies to the food market. The patenting of food and of fertilizers and so on is a really ghastly system that was undertaken under the World Trade Organization. I'm no expert on the World Trade Organization's rules, but it was something that big corporations embedded into the system, is to turn what they were making into a patent and to get the state, the power of the United States government behind it. Now, this is not free marketeer, this stuff, because when you patent something, the public law backs you up. And in markets, you're supposed to buy and sell according to demand and supply. But no, when the state backs you up, you can control the price of fertilizer or whatever it is your patent. And that was something done under the World Trade Organization, which, as I say, is not my patch.
Okay, thanks. Couple more questions. What country you've mentioned China, but what country has the best balance of a financial system that providing for-profit services, but without imperiling good governance? And then another question, how do we invest our money without adding to the wealth of the billionaire elites?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I just think we have to be very, very careful. There are I can't give advice on investment. It's not my work at all, and I wouldn't dream of doing that. But I do know that there are good companies who take some care to choose corporations which are good and sustainable. But really, I can't give that advice. And then, Sarah, again, I've forgotten the first one.
So, which country has a good balance of
Which
the
country has a
financial
good balance?
system and good governance?
It's really hard to know. I don't think there are any. Part of the reasons why we're going to have another financial crisis is because of all the imbalances in the global economy. And they're not just financial imbalances, they're also trade imbalances. So if you look at Germany, for example, or even at Europe as a whole, Europe has a system of export orientation where actually the priority inside the economy is given to exporters, and exporters are subsidized and benefited in lots of ways. And people prefer to export because it's more profitable than to invest in the domestic economy. At the same time, and this is quite complicated, I explain it in the book, wages at home are being repressed, not just in Europe, not just in Germany, but also in China, for example, and in particular in the United States. And so what's happening is that economies are producing more than can be consumed. And I always say this to the Greens. The problem isn't overconsumption. The problem is overproduction and underconsumption. People cannot consume all that their country produces. And that's why then the production is channeled outwardly and dumped on other markets, often on poor country markets and so on. Instead of it being used at home, if you like, to develop the economy at home. And so
Interesting.
I don't know there's any country that
Yeah,
hasn't got
yeah.
either a deficit or a massive surplus.
So sort of related, you mentioned about the Greens. There's a question here. Please explain how you're taking the current polycrises, such as crisis in climate, inequality, democracy, into account in your assessment of where we are with the financial system.
Well, I think the financial system is responsible for the crisis, really. And I say to the Greens, you cannot divide the world up into silos, and this is the green silo and this is the financial silo. No. Who is financing fossil fuel investment? It's the finance sector. It's that BlackRock with its $13 trillion of financial assets. They're pouring a lot of that money into fossil fuels because fossil fuels are very profitable, right? And we want our pensions to pay well when we retire, so we're very happy for them to go to the most proper source for investment. But the money that's being invested in fossil fuels, so there's no, I mean, we should have more, if you like, say over how that money is invested. Now, there was a moment in Europe where the ECB began to consider penalizing corporations that invested in fossil fuels, brown assets they were called, and rewarding those investing in green activity, green assets, and saying that actually they would accept green assets onto their balance sheets, but not brown assets, right? And that's an enormous power that the central banks could exercise over the economy. And of course, the fossil fuel sector destroyed it and made sure it didn't happen.
Mm.
So there are ways in which we could do it. But if we don't understand that the finance sector is like a fire hose aimed at the fossil fuel sector, and until we actually switch off that fire hose of money and credit, we're not going to be able to fix the ecosystem.
Thank you. Some more questions from the chat. You've hinted at this already, I think, but you started with Elon Musk and likened him to running a Ponzi scheme. This suggests a bubble that will burst as it did back in 2008.
Yeah.
So what's holding the financial system together now, or are we heading for another bust? And is that the nature of the system we have? So there'll always be boom and bust.
Um, yeah, I mean, it is the nature of the system we have. It is a boom and bust economy. Um, and Keynes called them animal spirits. There's just this belief that, if I throw my money at Elon Musk, I'm going to get richer. And for sure, the price will never fall. That sort of public delusion, the delusion of crowds, is something that we're in the midst of, really. So, yeah, no, it's.
There's a kind of counter thing. How then do you respond to other economists who claim that wealth reform, for example, would cause job losses and economic collapse, as billionaires are the ones creating the wealth and the jobs, and governments are less innovative and productive?
I would say that's absolute rubbish. I would say I would say that what I don't like about today's capitalism is that they're not capitalists. The whole theory of
Mm.
capitalism is that you've got to have free markets in which people take risks in order to make a profit. If they take a risk and they make a loss, then the market disciplines them, punishes them for investing in what has gone wrong, right? Today, capitalists say, sorry, I'm not taking any risks. Oh, no. I want the government to guarantee my investments. I will lend money to low income countries, but only if the taxpayer guarantees that I never, ever make any losses on that investment. That's not capitalism. That's a kind of Soviet style socialism, really. And so if they tell me that billionaires, you know, that the government is, and what's happening right now is that the private sector is refusing to invest. We have what's called an investment strike going on in Britain. It, we have very low levels of investment when we need to invest, for example, in the green economy, because these capitalists are just too damn scared to take a risk. If the public sector invested in, for example, building railways or building solar power or whatever, the private sector would then crowd in, would then start, because then we would be creating income, generating income, people would go shopping, they would buy stuff, and then the private sector would come to life. So what we're seeing is the private sector as timid and unambitious and selfish and greedy.
Yeah.
So not to worry.
So there's a few questions in the chat around sort of either, well, one big suggested alternative way of thinking or model, which is Kate Raworth's donut economics.
Mm.
And what do you think about that? And then two more specific policy solutions. One is around taxing income from investments, unearned income more heavily than earned income, which is a system that's been deliberately dismantled. Could it be resuscitated? And the other one about the Tobin tax. Could that ever be done?
Yeah, let me start with the Tobin tax. Absolutely, that's what I want to see, and on a grand scale.
And could you say what that is for any
A
that are
Tobin
not
tax
familiar?
is a tax on a flow of capital across borders, cross-border capital flows. And so if you bring your money in to invest in, I don't know, buying government bonds, British government bonds, then you will be taxed a small amount for that investment. And that's called a Tobin tax. It's called sand in the wheels of capital flows across borders. I would like to see more um, uh, barriers or friction in those capital flows than what the Tobin tax asks for. But the Tobin tax is a very modest demand and it can be done. Um, and then, Sarah, take me back again.
Then we've got around increasing taxes on unearned income as another
Yes, no, I
specific
mean,
policy solution.
this is the shocking story of Elon Musk not paying taxes,
Yes, yes.
And uh, definitely that, but the easier way of collecting taxes is by actually pinning people down at work and making sure that their employer collects the taxes for them. So that's why the workers get paid taxes, but the very rich tend to get away with not paying taxes. And one of the reasons why they can is because they can move the profits that they make from anything out of a country overnight and into a tax haven. So one of the problems with trying to tax the rich is their power to move money across borders. I find it very hard to move my money to a bank in Ireland, but they know how to do it really, and so they can avoid taxes that way.
And then donut economics.
So donut economics, I think what Kate is trying to show is that there are limited resources and that we have to think of the economy as working within the framework of a donut, if you like. There are boundaries, there are borders to how much we can consume and how much we can produce and how much we can extract from the economy. Yeah.
Thank you. You talked about the church and you talked about a couple of things around debt and usury and sin. Um, a couple of questions then about the faith response. We seem to know on some level that change is necessary, and lots of experts saying what we should do, but we fail to do it over and over again. What role do faith communities play in changing our narratives and our systems? And then the second question, thinking about it being the Catholic Year of Jubilee, lots of screenings of the People's Emergency Briefing, evidence of the impact of our warming climate, but little reduction of debt for less developed countries. To what extent do you think the Church has responded to your call for a reinvigoration of ethical values?
Well, not sufficiently, although I was very excited about Pope Leo's encyclical on AI.
Yes. Mm.
Um, and I do think he's offering moral leadership, and his attack on Trump and on the injustices of the ICE thing and so on. I mean, as an American, he has particular authority to do that. But, that's what I want to see the church being about, really, being active and being assertive of values. All, all of our regulation, all of our laws in the world are underpinned by basic values. Thou shalt not steal, is a fundamental value. But if you detach that value from what's really going on in the world and you make it possible to steal and make it easy to steal, then you know, where is the reassertion of that value? We've got to make it feel so bad that people steal, that they charge high rates of interest, so that we bring change. And yes, I mean, I witnessed the most extraordinary ecumenical movement during the Jubilee 2000 campaign. The churches had no trouble coming together. It's for some of them, especially for the evangelical churches, they began by saying, economics and politics is not for us, really. We don't do that stuff. But they pretty soon, I mean, I and many others persuaded them, sorry, economics and politics is the heart of the Christian faith and heart of the Old Testament, for goodness sake. And unless you understand that, you're not being fully Christian if you don't chase the money lenders from the temple. The way in which that particular story in the Bible has been modified and kind of, oh, well, it was they weren't paying taxes or something. No, he was chasing the money lenders from the temple in anger. Right? He used a whip, for example. I mean, for me, that's what the church should be about. And I know, because Jubilee 2000 demonstrated how Muslims could work with Catholics, could work with evangelicals, and then make a huge... Clinton said about the Jubilee 2000, this is the biggest tent I've ever known and one of the most effective. And that tent was a tent of faiths, people from across the world. Now, we worked damn hard to make that happen. And right now, I don't see that happening again. But, we know from very recent history that it's possible for the churches to unite in that way, for the faiths to unite in that way. But it needs willpower and it needs leadership and it needs people to get on with it, really. It needs just money to lead it seems.
Lead the charge. Absolutely. And we will come on to some practical ways that you can take action. But some more kind of personal questions, I suppose. Anne, what led you to get involved in this issue? How do you sustain yourself for the long haul? And what is giving you hope right now?
Wow. Right. Well, first of all, how did I get involved? Well, I was born in South Africa. I grew up under apartheid. I grew up in a white family in which there was awareness of apartheid, but in which it was just utterly taken for granted, as if we were in a fishbowl and it was the water that we lived within. And I used to go to church, and I noticed that my church was an all-white church, but that in church I was taught to love my neighbor as myself. But it turned out that I couldn't love my neighbor as myself if my neighbor was black. And so as I reached 18, 19, 20 university, I became very rebellious and angry and difficult because I just saw hypocrisy all around me, really. And I've never lost that. I've never lost that feeling of double standards and hypocrisy. When I see it, I get a little white light across the top of my head here. And what sustains me, I don't know, really, to be honest, I don't know. I've often thought it is my faith. I've often thought it's something beyond me. I don't know. And what gives me hope? Well, the only thing that gives me hope are young people now, really. And what also gives me hope is that I know that when people understand what's going on, they're empowered and they act. And also, I think what gives me hope is that I have this overwhelming conviction that the majority of people are good and loving and kind. And it's just the bad guys that have got hold of the levers, really. And I just, wherever I look around at humanity, I see that, and I think you can't kill that off, really. That's me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anne. And we are almost out of time. If there's maybe one last question in the chat, or I will just ask you to say a few final words in a moment, just to finish off. Um, So thanks to everyone who has put their questions in the chat or submitted them in advance. There were some questions about what we can do, and Anne said a bit about that. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment, about practical ways you can get involved through Just Money and in other ways in helping to shape a fairer, greener world. But Anne, just a couple of minutes if you want, just to a final word from you.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I always love talking to groups like yours. And I know you guys are capable of profound transformation. And I know also, and this is what gave me faith during Jubilee 2000, that people who are people of faith are really good people. And they were the ones that would get up in the morning, get out of bed to go and chain themselves to the church railings in order to talk about debtors, slavery, and so on. And I know you've all got it within you. And I urge you to be brave and go out and do this thing that we need to do.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. Okay, so one of the dangers with hearing all about the system that we are embedded in, our financial system and our wider economy, is that we can feel quite overwhelmed. We can feel quite hopeless about whether things can change. And so that's where it's really important that we come together, that we join with others. And that's why at Just Money, we're trying to build a movement of individuals and churches alongside people of other faiths and none to take all kinds of different actions. So I'm hoping that we'll have some slides coming up on our screen now, which will tell you a little bit about a few different ways that we can, that you can get involved. We have a couple of things coming up. Next week is actually Fair Tax Week. And so we've got Tax Justice Sunday, which is something that Just Money Movement hosts. That's on the 28th of June. So the weekend after next, and we have lots of resources on our website. There's a QR code there and a URL where you can find ways to help your church engage with this issue, thinking about tax from a theological point of view, from a faith point of view. We've talked quite a lot about how tax could and should play a role in tackling the injustices of extreme wealth and financial deregulation. And so do check that out on our website. That's one particular thing which happens every year and which is an opportunity for churches to start thinking about tax as a tool to help build flourishing communities and societies. We've also got, during the week leading up to Tax Justice Sunday, a webinar. So we have, go back to the challenge at Amazon one, Annie, I can talk about that first. So it's really important that we have specific ways that we can take action. And we know that Amazon is one of the biggest examples of a corporation that breaks the rules on tax, that avoids paying corporate tax to the level it should. It's just been in the news in the last week or so about their tax avoidance in the UK. And they are also known for their poor working practices and for their impact on the environment too. So we're asking people to challenge Amazon, to break the habit of always shopping with Amazon. But also we know that it's not just about individual consumer action. We need to change the rules. So we're going to be launching an action later this week asking you to write to your MP in support of a new UN tax convention that's being negotiated at the moment, because we need to fix the rules. We need the governments of the world to come together to fix the rules on tax. So we're having, that's the new campaign. You can check it out on our website. Next Thursday, the 25th, you can join us at lunchtime for a webinar about that campaign to help explain how Amazon gets around the rules. Amazon, just as an example, really, but obviously as the world's biggest retailer, a massive example of the kinds of ways that wealthy, really powerful, wealthy companies, as well as really powerful, wealthy individuals, get around the rules, avoid paying tax, and how we need a really strong UN tax convention to help tackle that and discover how you and your church as well can get involved if you're part of a church community in that campaign. So that's next Thursday, the 25th, at lunchtime. And do we have any other slides that I can? Yeah. So that's our main website, justmoney.org.uk. There's lots of URLs and QR codes there that can help you to get involved in those specific ways. We're also really keen that people feel part of a movement. Someone was asking in the chat about a summary of what we can do as a movement of individuals and church communities. There's lots of different things. We think it's important that we give people ways you can think about your own investments. For example, we have a whole Money Makes Change hub with a whole lot of signposting and ideas and suggestions to help you think through the ethics of your own money and your church's money. We have campaign actions that you can take, as I've mentioned, with the Challenge Amazon one at the moment. And we have ways that you can get your church and your community involved too, because we really think we need, as Anne has talked about with the Jubilee 2000 example, that broad-based movement, and we're trying to work to engage people in the Christian churches in that movement, but there's obviously working alongside lots of people from different faiths and people from secular movements as well, getting involved in taking action with our own money and speaking up for change as we seek a fairer, greener world together. Um, so we really want to give you positive things you can do. There's lots of links in the chat now, as well as the things that you've seen in those slides. And yeah, hope you feel that you can get involved. And I think that's all I'm going to say for now. So I'm just going to say thanks again to Anne before I close in prayer. And thanks to all of you for coming. I'm just going to pray as we conclude. Loving God, thank you for all that Anne has brought to us this evening, all the information and understanding that she's helped us to build. Thank you, Lord, for your abundant provision and for the beauty of your creation. But we know we live in a world where injustice is rife and where many struggle to survive. And we know our current financial system is part of the problem. Help us to better understand, to speak out and to act for a fairer, a greener, a more compassionate financial system and economy, and to stand in solidarity with all who suffer. In your name we pray. Amen.